See, there's no way for me to know if the sound's on or not.
Okay, we'll get started here. Once again, before the meeting starts, make sure that you speak slowly and into the microphone. And we're going to start our committee meeting right now. First up is Mr. Heidick in Parks, City Properties, Parks and Recreation.
Thank you, Mr. President. Call to order the City Properties Parks and Recreation. It is September 14th, 2020, 6 p.m., and we are in the Active Adult Center. All committee members are present, plus everyone else noted. Tonight we have two requests for legislation, both dealing with the same issue here. One is a letter from Mayor Judge requesting legislation for a grant request to the Barberton Community Foundation for the Newton Park and Soccer Complex project in an amount up to $500,000. And I'm going to read them both before I open up for remarks because they do deal with the same issue. The second piece is letter from Mayor Judge requesting legislation for a grant request to the Ohio Department of Natural Resources for the Newton Park and Soccer Complex project in an amount up to $500,000. And does the director have any words for the request? Go to the mayor first.
Yes, so the federal government put approximately $900 million into a fund geared towards parks. It's a matching grant proposal. So we want to apply to the feds for $500,000, which is the max. We don't believe we'll be going to the foundation for a full $500,000 to match it, but we wanted to have that leeway as we continue to do our due diligence. And we want to focus on the Newton Park area, create a soccer complex, which is going to take some stormwater mitigation efforts as well. We started surveying that property last year and doing some soil borings and things of that nature. So the application is due first part of November to the state.
Thank you. Are there any comments from the committee?
Yeah.
Mr. David?
Yeah, we spoke earlier with the Ward 1 Councilman, Mr. Greer, yourself, and Mr. Griffin about it a little bit. Got an email today that Brasher, who be the designer, a couple of participants asked about it.
According to the Board of Control request, the conceptual site plan estimate, presentation of rendering, contract vendor Thrasher for the amount of $10,025.
What we talked about earlier about what we had, them being fundraiser. Yes.
They've done quite a bit for us in the past, and that, I suppose that question could be answered to the mayor, who's the one that is going to be requesting this legislation.
Have you ever used them before?
Yeah.
And were they also any kind of fundraisers for any kind of thing going on in the last election, or any kind of concerts or anything like that going on?
Thrasher Engineering or employees for Thrasher Engineering?
Thrasher, employees or Thrasher?
Yeah, which is totally legal.
Totally. Have you used anybody else, or have you any other estimates anywhere else?
Not in this case. We've used other engineering firms for various projects. Thrasher we've been using for before I was even there, and they are the ones we typically go to for stormwater, but not exclusively.
Again, this is just all what our petitions were asking to ask during the council meeting. Now, do you want us to get other estimates for this, or we have to use these guys? Do you prefer to use these guys, or?
I left that to the department head, and she felt comfortable with the price and what their scope of duties was listed as.
Department head, that be Ms. Lisa?
Yes.
Ms. Lisa, have you got any other estimates from anywhere else, or?
No, again, because this project project involves both development of soccer fields and park improvements and stormwater mitigation. That firm does a lot of work with stormwater mitigation, so that's why they were chosen.
Is there a reason we can't use other people or get other estimates from somewhere else?
The estimate that we received follows all rules and laws that
Oh, no, I
apply.
mean, like, we might possibly be a little bit cheaper, you never know.
Well, once they can do the conceptual plan, we will still go out and, depending on the estimated cost, we'd go out to get quotes or bids. So this is just the first step.
Thank you.
So we used someone else to do the surveying last year, not associated with Thrasher. So, you know, we use a wide range of different firms when doing a project.
Thank you. Ms. Coburn?
Each one of the engineering companies that we use do have specialized areas that they work in. And like Mrs. McLean said, they work with flood mitigation mostly. So even though we have 10 or 12 different engineering firms, these guys know about flood mitigation in particular. And the other companies deal with other areas. So that's why Thrasher is most likely to know most about the flood mitigation that we have to deal with. It's not that they help us with any other area better or worse, but they know about the mitigation.
Exactly, I know that, just I want to make sure we get other prices and other estimates from other organizations and companies, so we get the best price before we just choose one and only one. So when you go purchase a car, you just don't go to the same dealership over and over again. You get comfortable with them, you go to different other dealerships, that way you can start, you know, other prices. I mean, right now, we need to save $10,000 to $20,000, maybe $50,000. Again, they might be the cheapest ones right now, but we know that for sure on paper.
I don't think cheapest is what we're
No, not
talking
cheapest.
about here, but they have the expertise we need for the job that we need done. You have to go with that too, because we could get it done a lot cheaper or more expensively, but not have the knowledge we need for the job.
But again, we're just getting comfortable with the same company. My main thing is we should start opening doors to other companies, give us more estimates and more knowledge too. Anybody else agree with me?
No, just vote.
Thank you. Okay. I guess my comment is this, and I think maybe where Mr. Neighbors confused is by Ohio or by Dakota, I believe that if it's an engineering or a professional service, it doesn't have to be bid. I agree with you moving down the line that I think that those are areas that we can get the lowest and or best bidder. And I am considering drafting some legislation in which we have to bid, unless it's an emergency, some of our professional services. So the reason that it doesn't have to be bid is because Ohio revised code says so. Did I answer that probably? Mrs. Miller?
Yes.
Jim?
I've got a couple of comments if that's all right.
But,
So a lot of the engineering firms that we use, you know, they each have their own niches, you know, but we do use a number of them. Aside from Thrasher, there's GPD, CT, we use Stantec at the water plant, Burgess and Nyepel. Each one of these engineering firms has institutional knowledge of the city of Barberton and the systems within the city of Barberton, whether it be the storm system, the water system, the sewer system, the plants themselves. No, it's not to say that you can't look elsewhere for engineering services, but when they have those foundations laid, and they've been involved with projects for many years, and they've been involved with different phases of projects for many years. And I've seen water plants with Burgess and Nyepel on them from 1940. So they've been around. Do they get every single job? No, but they do have an institutional knowledge. They've had a lot of work with the city over the years, so it goes way before Mayor Judge. This is something that the city's been doing for a large number of years.
And we are looking at other firms. I had our stormwater manager start pulling together some other additional firms. But that institutional knowledge, you can't put a price on that. Plus, what does the engineering firm get us in terms of grants? So free money to the city. A lot of these firms, all these firms that we use know how to apply for additional grant funding that we don't have the expertise in doing. So we will have additional engineering firms that we'll be using. And then I will tell you, in the past, before I was mayor, a small engineering firm was given a chance, and we used a recommendation, no track record with the city, and it was a complete failure that lasted for a good part of 10 years and cost the city a ton of money. So, we're not opposed to using new firms. There is a time issue with this one because of when the state grant is due, application. But we are looking at other firms across the board.
Mr. Mayor, I have a question. Does the contractor for the conceptual site plans, and this is me not knowing how the grants work, do those affect applying for the grants? Do those names have to be on there when we apply? So that, let's say we could consider these two pieces of legislation while you might feel you might want to shop around some, or does their name, the contractor's name have to be in the grant?
I believe the work either has to be substantially completed or at least started. We've done with you. Have more
What's the
insight?
question?
If, when we apply to the state for this grant funding, if the site, the plan has to be completed, or the contractor's name has to be on the application.
I don't think the contractor's name has to be on it.
Does the work have to be done or started?
No, but we of course would lay out exactly what we propose doing.
Thank you. Is there any other questions from the membership? Mr. Greer?
Thank you, Chair. Do we have a contract, where you provided a contract for the professional services?
I was only provided with the Board of Control request.
All right. Would we be able to get a contract, a copy of it, for the professional services from the engineering firm?
Director Ramirez, is that possible?
Yeah, we have.
2 or 3 pages.
Oh, thank you.
Do you have any other questions or comments about these? Mr. Gillespie?
Thank you, Chair. My question is this, because it's a matching grant, I guess, taking money from the state is great, but my concern is we up to $500,000 from the Barton Community Foundation, right now during, some financial, hard times. What happens if we get $500,000 and then we have to match $500,000, correct? We just not take what we get, and what happens if we can't complete the project based on what,
On not having a match?
yes.
So we don't anticipate going to the foundation for the full amount of the 500,000, but I wanted that leeway. If we can't come up with the matching funds, and we're looking in other areas, then we turn the project back over and not do it. So we are looking at other avenues. I prefer not to mention those avenues tonight, as we don't have any confirmations, but some of them, I'm waiting to hear back on confirmation on some of those before I would like to say them publicly.
Thank you. Is there any more questions or comments? Hearing none, do I have a motion to call for the first piece of legislation for the grant request to the Barton Community Foundation?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you.
I'll second that.
All those in favor? Aye. And can I have a motion on the second grant request to the Ohio Department of Natural Resources?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you.
I'll second
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Both pieces pass unanimously.
And once we continue down this road, if this goes to the full council and passes, we'll give you updates. Like I said, the grant to the state is due first part of November. So we've had a pretty good track record with the state. This is one of those programs where they throw a bunch of money into a fund and say, come apply for it, and they give you a short window to apply for it. So you really have to have a lot of things kind of shovel ready. Appreciate you guys passing this at the committee level, and if this passes full council, we'll keep you abreast of everything as we move forward.
Thank you.
I want to add too, this is really great news for not only national parks, state parks, local parks. Finally, this money is going to be like a permanent source of funding, which just has not been available in the past. And so, you know, starting now and into the future, there's going to be a lot more money available to all of us to be able to do many of the upgrades and, you know, maintenance type things in our parks, but there just hasn't been the funding to do. So it's good all the way around.
Thank you. For miscellaneous discussion, we had the shredding event where, let's see, 486 Summit County residents / businesses attended. 29,720 pounds, which is equivalent of 14.86 tons of unwanted documents, and 1,000 pounds of cardboard were shredded. Of the 486 attending, 173 or 36% were from Barberton. And we also have our concert tomorrow night at Tuscarora Park at 6 o'clock. And with that, is there any more miscellaneous discussion? Hearing none, can I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
We are adjourned at 6:17.
Next up is public welfare and safety. Mrs. DeVette.
I'd like to bring to order the Public Welfare and Safety meeting. It's Monday, September 14th, 2020 at 6:17 here in the Active Adult Center. All members of the committee are present, as well as all council members and all others noted. We have one late request for legislation, and it's a letter from Chief Persley requesting legislation to honor and give public recognition to Kevin King, who is retiring from the Ohio Task Force 1 after 20 years of service. So he is not retiring as a fireman here, but he is retiring from the Ohio Task Force. And so do I have a motion to call for this piece of legislation?
I'll make a motion.
Motion made by Mr. Greer. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Griffin. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Well, I'm sorry, I messed up. I didn't vote the rules for that one, is that what I asked for? Okay, I thought I did, I apologize. Did everybody receive the, email from Mr. Persley? I just wanted everyone to get a chance to look at, his accomplishments since May of 1997. So if you didn't, I'll scan it and email it. Probably just start emailing it.
It'll be with the draft next week.
It will be, okay. I just want everybody to look at it because it's pretty impressive, so. Does anybody have any questions about this piece of legislation? Hearing none, do I have a motion to call for this?
I'll make a motion.
Motion made by Mr. Greer, do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Griffin, all in favor?
Aye.
And it passes unanimously. Tonight, we will be voting on two pieces of legislation from safety. The first one is ordinance number 94, 2020, titled Enter into Agreement with the City of Norton and Copley Township. I know we had a few questions last week about this. I did clarify with Mr. Flager when he arrived this evening, and he did say that this is imperative to pass as an emergency because we have not been paid by either community for 2020. So, we, need to pass this so that we can generate the invoice. Does anyone have any questions about that piece of legislation? I'm sorry,
I just have a little question.
Yes.
We didn't have both copies, but they are supposedly exactly the same for Norton and Copley.
That's what the.
Right.
And the one that we had was the actual agreement, so,
Yes.
okay, thank you. I just wanted to clarify.
Any other questions? Okay, and the next ordinance that we will be voting on this evening from safety is ordinance number 95, 2020, titled Disposal of Vehicles from the Police Department. Does anyone have any questions about this piece of legislation? No. Any miscellaneous discussion? Chief, you have anything for us?
No.
No. I just wanted to say that I listened to the, I turned on my police scanner during, on, I forget what night it was, and there was a chase, and the officers did an amazing job, so. Anyone else have anything?
I also want to thank the police department and the fire department for the help parade on Saturday. The team time, I've been on 5 and also continuing forward during the police chase, so thanks again for that too. When we were hurt, the fourth wards, that we were safe. And thanks again for the police department and fire department for joining.
Anybody else have anything? Hearing nothing, do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Motion made by Mr. Greer. Do I have a second? Second by Mr. Griffin. We are adjourned at 6:22.
Okay, next up is Rules Marketing and Development, Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. President. Rules, Marketing, and Development. I would like to call this meeting to order today, September 14th, 2020. We're meeting at the Active Adult Center. All members present and all of those noted we don't want to. Tonight, we have no requests for legislation. Are there any miscellaneous topics or rules tonight? Hearing none, do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Second, adjourn at 6:24.
Okay, utilities, Mrs. Copeland.
This is September 14th. We are in the Active Adult Center. All members of the city utilities are present. This evening, we have current legislation, ordinance number 92, 2020, titled OPWC Funding Application, WWTP Improvements Phase 3B. We discussed that pretty much last week. And the second one is ordinance number 93, 2020, OPWC funding application, WWTP improvements, phase 3C. Both of these are improvements to the sewer department. Do we have any additional questions from the committee? Any from anyone else? Do we have any miscellaneous discussion for utilities? May I entertain a motion to adjourn?
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
I'll second
We have a motion from Carol Fry and a second from Carla DeBevick, and we are adjourned at 6:25.
Okay, finance personnel, Mrs. Fry.
Right. It is Monday, September the 14th. We're in the Active Adult Center. All members of the Finance and Personnel Committee are present, as well as guests as noted on my sheet. The time is 6:26, and we are beginning our meeting. Tonight, Finance has 10 pieces of legislation on the agenda. The first is ordinance number 96/2020, which is an appropriation from the fire capital in the city grant fund. And it is to deposit grant money that we got into the capital budget for fire. The grant is in the amount of $20,000. It was received from Halmet Aerospace. And do I have any questions about that piece of legislation? No. The second piece of legislation is also fire capital levy capital budget. This particular piece of legislation is for the sale of an ambulance, and this is appropriating $4,169.63 from the unappropriated item of the fire capital levy fund to the fire capital levy capital budget. Any questions on that? Okay, the third piece of legislation is ordinance number 98/2020. This is also an appropriation concerning the fire department, and it is money for the operating budget. It is $1,117.34. This, we are appropriating that amount from the unappropriated item of the general fund to the fire department's operating budget. And this money is from scrap from the fire department that was sold on gov.deals. Any questions? Okay, the next piece of legislation is number 99/2020. This piece of legislation is Barberton Residential Services Relief Program, and we are amending it. We are amending the amount of money, the income level. It was at $27,000 and it is being raised to $30,000. This was done by the administration due to the fact that there hasn't been an increase for that particular program in quite some time, and then with the COVID issues. Any questions about that? Okay. The next piece of legislation is a resolution number 100/2020. This is COVID-19 fire paramedic personnel. This is a resolution declaring fire paramedic personnel as being substantially dedicated to mitigating and preventing the spread of COVID-19 and declaring an emergency. It was determined by the chief, Rob Fursley, that 90% of the work being done by EMS paramedics is COVID-related work. Any questions about that? Okay, the next piece of legislation is ordinance number 101/2020. This is titled Appropriation Local Coronavirus Relief Fund. And this particular piece of legislation is an ordinance appropriating $998,205.16 from the unappropriated item of the local coronavirus relief fund to the personnel service budget of the local coronavirus relief fund and declaring an emergency. I checked with Mr. Flaker today, and because we discussed where the money actually came from, and it is actually from the feds, this particular amount. All right, any questions on that piece of legislation? The next piece of legislation is resolution number 102, 2020. It is titled Ohio Deferred Compensation. This piece of legislation is to add another way of savings to employees that are in the 457 plan. Currently, you can save money, but it's on a tax deferred basis, but they are adding a Roth 457 option. Any questions for that? On that? No? All right, the next piece of legislation is ordinance number 103, 2020, titled Temporary Modification of the Non-Bargaining Personnel Policy. This particular piece of legislation will allow non-bargaining personnel to carry over an additional 5 days of vacation because of COVID this year, and they usually can only take carry over 5, but people were off for quite some time, and we don't want to have a lot of people off towards the end of the year, so they can carry 5 days of their vacation over into 2021. Any questions about that? Okay. The next piece of legislation is ordinance number 104, 2020, title Authorized Payment, U.S. Department of Interior. This piece of legislation is paying an invoice in the amount of $60,000 for expenses incurred for the installation of 2 stream gauges with precipitation gauges at each location and declaring an emergency. This was done some time ago, but it's one of those instances that we didn't get the PO until after the work had already been completed. And it's over $3,000, so we have to pass this in order to have it paid. These stream gauges and precipitation gauges have been installed because of the flooding issues in town, and this will help us to be able to track it better. Any questions on that? Mr. Grip?
Thank you, Chair. This is a reimbursable grant, correct?
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks for pointing that out. The next piece of legislation is resolution number 105, 2020. This resolution is to amend resolution number 89, 2020, additional tax levy resolution to proceed to the ballot. Basically, the only thing that this piece of legislation is for is to change the ballot language, and that was changed per the Secretary of State. And it changed how that read. Do I have any questions about that?
Can you read that for us? Do you have that in front of you?
No, I do not, but I can probably find it. It's in, it is in the, here it is. An additional tax for the benefit of the city of Barberton for the purpose of current operating expenses. At a rate not exceeding 3 mils for each $1 evaluation, which amounts to 30 cents for each $100 evaluation for 3 years, commencing in 2020, first due in calendar year 2021. And I had what was previously there.
It was the ORC code number.
I beg your pardon.
It was the
Here it
ORC.
is. Yes, it was. The previous language said an additional tax for the benefit of the city of Barberton for the purpose of ensuring sufficient funds for the city. For the city's current operating expenses as authorized under revised code 5705.19 and revised code 5705.191. That's the sentence that was changed. Okay. Yes.
I'd like to make a clarification.
Fine.
So on resolution number 100,
I just want to clarify that the fire department calls 90% of their calls as EMS calls, not necessarily as COVID-19. But what they do as a result of all of their EMS calls is mitigating systems to make sure that the ambulances are clean, that the police cruisers are clean, things that you run, and other resources. So I think that's, before we get to the next one, about the funding, the actual funding itself is,
I already did that. Are you saying the relief fund, the 998,000?
yes.
Okay, I already did that one.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that that's clear that not 90% of the calls are COVID-19, but that they're EMS calls. And then as a result of all EMS calls, they have to protocol to follow.
We discussed that last week. Yeah,
Okay.
we discussed the fact that it wasn't just the calls. They're even cleaning police cars, I believe. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. All right, any other questions about those 10 pieces of legislation? Okay, we're going to move on. We have, both finance reports for the month of July and the month of August, 2020. And Mr. Flaker, Mr. Flaker is here and he's going to, guide us through them.
All right.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Let's start with the month of July, in the health insurance fund. The revenues for the month of July was, 319,000, expenditures 348,000. That was, expenditures exceeded our revenues by about 30,000. That brought the unexpended fund balance down to 784,000. The years to date, revenues and expenditures for that fund. Revenues are $2,358,000, expenditures $2,232,000, gives us a net year to date as a positive $125,000. Moving on to the income tax, for the month of July, our estimate was $932,000. Our actual came in at $888,000 roughly. Our estimate for 2020 is $6,892,000. Our actuals for the year in the month of July was $6,756,000. That makes us under our estimate by about $135,000. In the month of July, we transferred $1 million to the general fund. That left us with about $4.4 million to transfer for the year. Moving on to the statement of cash receipts and disbursements, we had a few funds in the negative. The first one is the FEMA fund. That's coming from the purchasing of houses on 14th Street for that stormwater mitigation over there. That money will be reimbursed to us from FEMA as soon as we spend the money and turn in all the documents to FEMA for those expenditures will reimburse us for. The other fund in the negative is Fund 250, the CDBG fund. That's the federal HUD, or the HUD grant fund. Will be reimbursed as soon as we make the expenditures and turn those expenditures into the federal government. The next fund in the negative is Fund 517, the Northern Sanitary Sewer Construction Fund. That is in the negative, as I previously stated, every month. That's the one where we're doing the construction in order for the sanitary sewers. We're going to get reimbursed by OPWC or OWDA for those expenditures. And then the next one in the negative is the health insurance fund. That's only in the negative because the encumbrance is outstanding as due to our health insurance through Summit County. So as each month goes by, that encumbrance goes down and revenues go into that fund. So that will be slowly getting out of the negative. Looking at the last 3 months of activities, the general fund and special revenues funds stay about the same, while the enterprise funds went down. The enterprise funds went down due to an increase in encumbrances outstanding. The final area, the all other funds, that increased due to the healthcare chargebacks. Like I said, we're paying Summit County for our healthcare. We're doing the chargebacks to the department, which is putting revenue into the health insurance fund, which is helping with that. Well, not look back up, but to get it closer to its true cash position without the encumbrances. Looking at the prior year, the current year for July, the general fund is up about 600,000. It is due to the higher starting balance compared to 2019. And then we have more revenues in the general fund this year compared to last year. And however, the encumbrances outstanding are more this year than compared to last year. Special revenue funds are up. A lot of that has to do with the CARES Act money that we received, that $998,000 that we're asking for the appropriation for. Enterprise funds is down by about $1 million. All other funds shows in the negative by $18,000, but if you look more at the cash balance, you will notice that the cash balance is only up $100,000 from last year. And that is a month gone.
Thank you, Jim. Did anybody have any questions for them, Dawn?
Were those actuals, or have they given us the actual figures for, I think last time we talked about April?
Yes. Last month, they did give us the actuals for May. So they're still a couple months behind in getting us actual information. And if you notice, if you look at if you compare July 2020 and the pending allocation dollar amount in the income tax council report, and compare it to the August 2020, you'll see that pending allocation dollar amount change. That pending allocation is where we're putting the estimates that they gave us. So once we get actuals, we'll move it out of that pending allocation, move it into its proper classifications as withholdings, business, individuals, penalties, and interest, so on and so forth. We'll move that into there. But once again, we did receive more advancements from CCA. So like I said, we're still like 2-3 months behind on getting actual information from CCA. But I did notice the time frame to get the actuals for May. That the time frame is shortening, so that to me is a good sign that they're trying to get caught up in their. So hopefully here shortly, I should have, hoping in the next week or so, have the actuals for June, and then hopefully shortly after that, the month of July, which will be a true sign because of the tax safety being pushed back to July 15th. So that was my next question.
Okay. No other questions?
Okay, month of August. Starting with the health insurance fund again, the month of August, the revenues were $472,000, expenditures were $329,000. As you guys will notice, the unexpended fund balance, that is a typo on your guys' spreadsheet. It says the unexpended fund balance is $784,010. The unexpended fund balance is actually $927,000, $927,192 is the actual unexpended fund balance for that fund. The net year to date for the health insurance fund is a positive $268,000. And moving on to income tax. Looking at the estimate for the month of August, the estimate is $876,000. The actuals came in at $1,281,000. Now, one thing I do want to point out, that estimate is based on historical data. Historical data does not have the tax deadline as July 15th. So that is throwing, when you're comparing the estimate to the actual, you have to understand that the tax, since they delayed the tax deadline this year, that's what's throwing that actual off. And I stated in the previous month's reports that in the month of August and September, we will start seeing these numbers be higher than usual because of that delay in the tax revenue. So that's what you see there.
So when you say that this is an actual, it's not actually an actual?
It's not a true actual.
Okay.
The estimate is based upon what we estimated when we did the budget for this year. So it's truly what we guess on historical data, what the collections are roughly, based upon percentage of our collections for each month, and we based upon that. The actual, what we received from, I should say, when I talk about actuals, I'm talking about what we actually received from CCA.
Well, I guess my question is, if they don't know what, if they don't have all the numbers, is this truly the actual?
It's truly not the actual, because we could have more advancements.
Okay, but thank you, I was just,
Yeah.
because it said actual, I was like, wait a minute, they haven't
Yeah.
got our actual. so-
Usually, like you said in the past, it's usually not this delayed, so it mostly is an actual. But in this case, in this year, I should say, the actual is more of what we received from CCA.
Thank you. Sorry.
Oh, that's fine. And then, so if you look at the estimate, for 2020, we had an estimated $7,768,000. Our actual is actually above that. Our actual is coming in at $8,037,000. That is over our estimate by $269,000. That, without contacting every business in town, that's leading me to believe, with us being over our estimate right now again, it's leading me to believe how many businesses in Barberton shut down during COVID, back in the months of March and April. I also stated in previous months that we had that positive, where we were ahead of our estimates by $500,000 back in the month of March. I said, I'm hoping that we can ride that out. And that come August, September, we'll start having higher months to get us either break even or start getting us back at that schedule. And that is so far coming through. Now, word of caution is, as we know with COVID, things can change in a heartbeat. So if there is more shutdowns or something come fall, we can get right back to our estimate once again. So right now it looks positive, but as we all know, things can change with COVID. For the month of August, we transferred $1.4 million to the general fund. That $1.4 million leaves us with just under $3 million to transfer to the general fund. That roughly breaks out to us needing to transfer $745,000 in the last 4 months of the year, which, based upon historical data and if things continue the way they are, as long as there's no unforeseen circumstances, we should be able to transfer to the general fund this year in the tax fund. Going to the statement of cash receipts and disbursements, going over the funds that are in the negative. Once again, it's the FEMA fund still. And the next fund in the negative is the CDBG fund. Next fund in the negative is the Northern Sanitary Sewer Construction Fund, and the final fund in the negative was the Health Insurance Fund. But when you look at the Health Insurance Fund in July in comparison to the month of August, you see that that negative number is getting smaller. Like I said, that's due to us paying Summit County, lowering the encumbrance outstanding, getting the chargebacks into that fund. Looking at the last 3 months' activity, the general fund is up by about $600,000. It's up because of that larger transfer from compared to last month. And then we also have fewer disbursements, so we have fewer expenses in the month of August. The special revenue fund stayed basically the same. Enterprise funds, it was up by about $200,000. All other funds, as you can see, is now out of the negative. It's $455,000. But like I said, this is the first year we took the encumbrance out for our health insurance. So if you look at the cash balance is at about 2 million, which is about, up by about 160,000 compared to last month. Moving on, comparing August of 19 to August of 2020, you will notice the unencumbered cash balance for the general fund is up by about 1.6 billion. It's because the disbursements are down by about 900,000. We also have $550,000 more in transfers, and of course, that cash balance at the beginning of the year was higher than last year. Special revenue funds is up by about 2 million. Part of that is because the cash balance is higher at the beginning of the year compared to last year. Disbursements are down by about 800,000, and we also have that CARES Act money, 998,000. Moving on to the enterprise funds are down by about $1 million. That's down due to the disbursements being up by $1 million. So we're having more expenditures in enterprise funds this year compared to last year. And then all other funds is down about roughly $300,000 compared to last year. If you look at the cash balance at August 31st, you'll notice that last year it was $2,397,000. This year it's $2,015,000. That's because if you look, the year-to-date receipts is down compared to last year. A lot of that has to do with the healthcare holiday that we took in January. The healthcare holidays that we took in 2019 did not go, we didn't take those until the end of the year. So basically, it's 1 month apart. Healthcare contracts is why that fund is down $300,000. And that's all.
Anybody have any questions about all this? Thanks. All right, do I have a motion to call for the acceptance of the July and August 2020 finance reports?
I'll make a motion that we call for these.
Okay, motion made by Mrs. Angeloff and seconded by Mr. Medges. I saw your hand, Greg. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All right, is there any miscellaneous discussion for finance committee tonight? Mr. Slater.
I just wanted to let council know, last week we did receive additional funding from the federal government for the CARES Act. So I will be sending to council another appropriation out of the local coronavirus relief fund to get that money appropriated so the city can use those funds accordingly to help the city. It was roughly 500,000, so I just wanted to make council aware that that piece of legislation will be funded. I've been talking with the fire chief. He has a few things that he's thinking that we can use the money for, and it will also go to grants for investment grants. I just want to put you guys
Thank
Thank you, Mr. Slater. What about the money from the county? Have you received that yet, or is that?
No, I'm gonna have to contact the county. I haven't heard anything from them for a few weeks now, so I plan on putting an email into the county this week, seeing what's up with the their cable support program that we passed for the creation of the fund and participate in, and see what's going on with that, so we can start using some of that for some of our public safety.
Anyone else?
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay.
So the total for the CARES Act is about what, 1.4 million, something like that?
Yeah, 1.4, 1.5 million.
Okay.
Without the county.
Without.
The county's, roughly about 770,000, I think.
You need money for roads, possibly?
No, unfortunately not.
Anybody else have any questions or comments? Do I have a motion? Mr. Devitt made a motion, and Mrs. Angela seconded, and we are adjourned at 6:55 p.m.
Okay, we'll take a 5-minute break and we'll go right into, next meeting.
You checked on it. We got one back today. That's my understanding. We don't check on it. Yeah, eventually, they'll probably have to issue one for
Oh, you're not.
Not long. I told my wife when we were down. I said, you know, it was so down. I'm like, I told my wife, I don't know. Because it is back. Oh, yeah. I did competition on both on the problem. People do more, you know. I'm serious. Yeah. Yeah, they want to make $20 start, yeah. No, about 100% going in and it's for a restaurant, going into nice restaurant just to get ice cream. And there was no one there either, so. Yeah. And then I'll be honest, hey, I get you. Reminded me that winter's right around the corner.
Yeah, you know, I kind of like this time of the year, there's off.
Let that occupy our
Winter's not wild.
Still does.
Fewer breaks. Water breaks.
Take a look.
Open the door, Caroline, water was ready to go to Caroline.
Under the service. Yeah, she works in the same office, man.
Yeah, but there's-
She has.
I mean, if I start feeling the water around the I'm like, done.
I didn't forget. It's just been a Monday.
I'm gonna meet with you here soon. Your John will set us
It's not hard.
It was fun, actually.
Oh, I love it.
Probably not gonna do one this fall.
No,
not really.
And you spend the Those officers that were
It's been a wild month or so.
Is the curve off?
We need
I remember, I was
I can't say. Yeah. Come on. Yeah, at least slow down. Slow down.
Why is it backwards?
It plays.
Yeah.
We see it.
Okay. I didn't notice it the last week. You're on the other side.
When you're trying to set it up, it's kind of. We're getting ready to start. I'm going to talk to you.
Oh, you're talking OPWC? Oh, no. The service.
I heard Warren and
We have a discount. You know, with that other number. This is.
Yeah, so there's they were.
Okay, let's get going.
So, yeah, they own mine and the insurance bill. So if there's anything.
Yeah, I'll get one. I'm sure you have. Okay, I'll get with you. Sure.
Okay, this is a regular legislative meeting of the Barberton City Council. Today is Monday, September 14th, 2020. It is 7:08. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, followed by an invocation of the Spirit.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Heavenly Father, be present with us now. Let all our deliberations tend to your glory and the furtherance of gospel. Let our discussions be charitable and our conclusions fruitful. May the breeze of your Holy Spirit breathe upon us instead of long-windedness. Let there be no fighting of corners or sacrificing long-term trust for short-term popularity. In short, dear Father, may this meeting end on time with your kingdom further. To the one who used few words, but to great effect. Last but not least, bless our first responders and our men and women and our armed forces wherever they may be. Jesus Christ our Lord, amen.
Clerk, please call the roll.
Mrs. Angela. Here. Mrs. Coker.
Here.
Mrs. Devitt. Here. Mrs. Frye.
Here.
Mr. Greer.
Present.
Mr. Griffin.
Here.
Mr. Heine.
Here.
Mr. Taylor.
Here.
Okay, before we get started, Council Rule 103 states the regular legislation and committee of the whole meetings shall start at 7:30 p.m. Since we are starting earlier than this, we need to invoke Council Rule 702. Mrs. DeBevick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to invoke Council Rule 702 to suspend Council Rule 103.
Thank you. And Mr. Hyde?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll second the motion to suspend 702, or to invoke 702 to suspend 103.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. DeBevick, second by Mr. Hyde, to invoke Council Rule 702 to suspend Council Rule 103. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. Approval of the minutes of the regular legislative meeting. Mrs. DeBevick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to make a motion for the approval of the minutes of the regular legislative meeting held on Monday, July 27th, 2020, as presented.
And Mr. Hyde.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion to approve the minutes of the regular legislative session.
Thank you. It was moved by Mrs. DeBevick and second by Mr. Hyde to approve the minutes of the regular legislative meeting held on Monday, July 27th, 2020, as presented. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The minutes are adopted. Approval of the minutes of the special session. Mrs. DeBevick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to make a motion for the approval of the minutes of the special session held on Monday, August 3rd, 2020, as presented.
Thank you. And Mr. Hyde.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion to approve the minutes of the special session.
Thank you. It was moved by Mrs. DeBevick and second by Mr. Hyde to approve the minutes of the special session held on Monday, August 3rd, 2020, as presented. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Any opposed? Minutes are adopted. Acceptance of the finance report. Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the acceptance of the Finance Department reports for the months of July and August 2020 as presented.
Thank you. And Mrs. DeBevick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Fry's motion.
Thank you. It was moved by Mrs. Fry, second by Mrs. DeBevick, to approve the Finance Department's report for the months of July 2020 and August 2020 as presented. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Any opposed? Financial report is accepted. Petitions and claims.
There are none.
Matters requested.
They've been passed out.
Citizens addressing council.
I have none.
Okay, first readings of ordinances and resolutions.
Okay, on the first one, everyone should have received the updated code of regulations submitted by Mayor Judge with the requested revisions for the following ordinance. Ordinance number 191, 2020, presented by Mrs. Angela, titled Formation of a Community Improvement Corporation. An ordinance authorizing the formation of a community improvement corporation, the city of Arlington, and improving its articles of incorporation and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mrs. Angela.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule, as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter, be suspended.
Thank you. And Mrs. Colbert.
Thank you, Mr. President. I second that motion for suspension.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Angela, second by Mrs. Colburn, to suspend the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Mr. Hyde.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have requested the suspension of this to go only one reading. This piece of legislation had been introduced in April, and we've gone the equivalent of double-digit readings. Only additions have been made, no subtractions, and I think it's to the benefit of everything that we move forward. Thank you.
Okay, any other remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Devitt,
Yes.
Mr. Hyde,
Yes.
Mr. Griffin,
Yes.
Mrs. Fry,
Yes.
Mrs. Angela,
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn,
Yes,
Mr. Jager,
Yes.
Mr. Good.
Yes.
Motion to adopt, Mrs. Angela.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that ordinance number 91-2020 be adopted as presented.
And Mrs. Colbert.
thank you, Mr. President. I second that motion for adoption.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Angela, second by Mrs. Colbert, to adopt ordinance number 91, 2020. Are there any remarks? Mr. Hyde.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to thank the mayor, the council, and every department head. The culmination of this piece of legislation showed that if we work together, we can not just come together on something that is going to benefit us not next year, not 2 years, not 25 years, but 30 years down the road. And I view this as a testament to no matter what arguments we've had or differences we had made, this is what can happen, something good and something that can benefit us all logistically, calmly, questions answered, concerns met, and I think it's time to move forward.
Thank you. Mrs. Angela.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to thank everybody for working together on this. Any suggestions or recommendations that were emailed to the mayor or me, we discussed this openly, and I think we did put a lot of time and patience into this. And this is something that we can use in the future, many, many years down, and it's for the community. And I just wanted to thank everybody who worked with the mayor and me on this. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Greer,
Yes.
Mr. Jaber,
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn,
yes,
Mrs. Angela,
Yes.
Mrs. Frye,
Yes.
Mr. Griffin,
Yes.
Mr. Heidi,
Yes.
Mrs. Devetter.
Yes.
Ordinance number 92, 2020, presented by Mrs. Coburn, titled OPWC Funding Application, Wastewater Treatment Plant Improvements, Phase 3B. A resolution authorizing the mayor of the city of Arlington to prepare and submit a funding application to the Ohio Public Works Commission, OPWC, for the wastewater treatment plant improvements, Phase 3B project, and declare an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mrs. Coburn.
thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
And Mrs. Frye.
Thank you, Mr. President. I second Mrs. Coburn's motion to suspend.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Coburn, second by Mrs. Frye, to suspend the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Angela,
Yes.
Mr. Jaber,
Yes.
Mr. Greer,
Yes.
Mr. Griffin,
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn,
Yes,
Mrs. Frye,
Yes.
Mrs. Devetter,
Yes.
Mr. Heidi.
Yes.
Motion to adopt, Mrs. Coburn.
thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 92, 2020.
Thank you. And Mrs. Frye.
Thank you, Mr. President. I second Mrs. Coburn's motion to adopt.
Motion was made by Mrs. Coburn, second by Mrs. Frye, to adopt ordinance number 92, 2020. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Heidi,
Yes.
Mrs. Devetter,
Yes.
Mrs. Frye,
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn,
Yes,
Mr. Griffin,
Yes.
Mr. Greer,
Yes.
Mr. Jaber,
Yes.
Mrs. Angela.
Yes.
Ordinance number 93, 2020, presented by Mrs. Coburn, titled OPWC Funding Application, Wastewater Treatment Plant Improvements, Phase 3C. A resolution authorizing the mayor of the city of Arlington to prepare and submit a funding application to the Ohio Public Works Commission, OPWC, for the wastewater treatment plant improvements, Phase 3C project, and declared an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mrs. Coburn.
thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
And Mrs. Frye.
Thank you, Mr. President. I second Mrs. Coburn's motion to suspend.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Coburn, second by Mrs. Frye, to suspend the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Griffin,
Yes.
Mrs. Angela,
Yes.
Mr. Heidi,
Yes.
Mr. Jaber,
Yes.
Mrs. Frye,
Yes.
Mr. Greer,
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn,
Yes,
Mrs. Devetter.
Yes.
Motion to adopt, Mrs. Coburn.
thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 93, 2020.
Thank you, and Mrs. Frye.
Thank you, Mr. President. I second Mrs. Coburn's motion to adopt.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Coburn, second by Mrs. Frye, to adopt ordinance number 93, 2020. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Devetter,
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn,
Yes,
Mr. Greer,
Yes.
Mrs. Frye,
Yes.
Mr. Jaber,
Yes.
Mr. Heidi,
Yes.
Mrs. Angela,
Yes.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Ordinance number 94, 2020, presented by Mrs. Devetter, titled Enter into Agreement, City of Norton and Coffin Township. An ordinance authorizing the mayor to enter into an agreement with the City of Norton and Coffin Township for jail services through December 31st, 2021, and declare an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mrs. DeBevick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
And Mr. Greer.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Bevick's motion for suspension.
Thank you. Motion was made by, excuse me, motion was made by Mrs. DeBevick and second by Mr. Greer to suspend the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Greer,
Yes.
Mrs. Frye,
Yes.
Mrs. Angela,
Yes.
Mr. Heidi,
Yes.
Mr. Jaber,
Yes.
Mrs. DeBevick?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
yes,
Motion to adopt, Mrs. DeBevick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 94, 2020.
Thank you, and Mr. Greer.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Bevick's motion for adoption.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. DeBevick, second by Mr. Greer to adopt ordinance number 94, 2020. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Coburn?
yes,
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. DeBevick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Heidi?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Frye?
yes,
Mr. Greer?
Yes.
Ordinance number 95, 2020, presented by Mrs. Frye, titled Disposal of Vehicles, Police Department. An ordinance authorizing the police chief to scrap salvage 27 vehicles deemed to be no longer needed for any municipal purpose and unfit and unsafe for disposal in any other manner and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mrs. DeBevick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule is required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you, and Mr. Greer.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Bevick's motion on suspension.
Motion was made by Mrs. DeBevick, and second by Mr. Greer to suspend the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. DeBevick?
Yes.
Mrs. Frye?
yes,
Mrs. Coburn?
yes,
Mr. Heidi?
Yes.
Mr. Greer?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Motion to adopt, Mrs. DeBevick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 95, 2020.
Thank you, and Mr. Greer.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Bevick's motion for adoption.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. DeBevick, second by Mr. Greer to adopt ordinance number 95, 2020. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Greer?
Yes.
Mr. Heidi?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
yes,
Mrs. Frye?
yes,
Mrs. DeBevick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Ordinance number 96, 2020, presented by Mrs. Frye, titled Appropriation, Fire Capital in the City Grant Fund. An ordinance appropriating $20,000 from the unappropriated item of the City Grant Fund to Fire Capital in the City Grant Fund and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mrs. Frye.
thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
And Mrs. DeBevick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Fry's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Frye, second by Mrs. DeBevick to suspend the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Frye?
Yes,
Mr. Greer?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
yes,
Mrs. DeBevick?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
yes,
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Heidi?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Motion to adopt, Mrs. Frye.
thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 96-2020.
And Mrs. DeBevick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Fry's motion on adoption.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Frye, second by Mrs. DeBevick to adopt ordinance number 96, 2020. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Heidi?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. DeBevick?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
yes,
Mr. Greer?
Yes.
Mrs. Frye?
Yes,
Ordinance number 97, 2020, presented by Mrs. Frye, titled Appropriation, Fire Capital Levy Capital Budget. An ordinance appropriating $4,169.63 from the unappropriated item of the Fire Capital Levy Fund to the Fire Capital Levy Capital Budget and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mrs. Frye.
thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you, and Mrs. DeBevick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Fry's motion on suspension.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Frye, second by Mrs. DeBevick to suspend the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Heidi?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
yes,
Mrs. DeBevick?
Yes.
Mr. Greer?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin,
Yes.
Mr. Jaber,
Yes.
Mrs. Frye,
Yes.
Mrs. Angela.
Yes.
Motion to adopt, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 97-2020.
Thank you, and Mrs. DeBevick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Fry's motion on adoption.
Motion was made by Mrs. Fry, second by Mrs. DeBevick to adopt ordinance number 97, 2020. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Angela,
Yes.
Mrs. Frye,
Yes.
Mr. Jaber,
Yes.
Mr. Griffin,
Yes.
Mr. Greer,
Yes.
Mrs. DeBevick,
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn,
Yes,
Mr. Heidi.
Yes.
Ordinance number 98, 2020, presented by Mrs. Frye, title appropriation, Fire Department operating budget. An ordinance appropriating $1,117.34 from the unappropriated item to the general fund to the fire department's operating budget and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
And Mrs. DeBevick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Fry's motion on suspension.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Fry, second by Mrs. DeBevick, to suspend the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. DeBevick,
Yes.
Mr. Heidi,
Yes.
Mr. Griffin,
Yes.
Mrs. Frye,
Yes.
Mrs. Angela,
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn,
yes,
Mr. Jaber,
Yes.
Mr. Greer.
Yes.
Motion to adopt, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 98-2020.
And Mrs. DeBevick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I second Mrs. Fry's motion on adoption.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Fry, second by Mrs. DeBevick, to adopt ordinance number 98, 2020. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Greer,
Yes.
Mr. Jaber,
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn,
yes,
Mrs. Angela,
Yes.
Mrs. Frye,
Yes.
Mr. Griffin,
Yes.
Mr. Heidi,
Yes.
Mrs. DeBevick.
Yes.
Ordinance number 99, 2020, presented by Mrs. Frye, titled Amend Ordinance number 110, 2008, Barberton Residential Services Relief Program. An ordinance amending ordinance number 110, 2008 by amending section 2, part B and C by increasing the income level from $27,000 annually to $30,000 annually and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rules required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you, and Mrs. DeBevick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Fry's motion on suspension.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Fry, second by Mrs. DeBevick, to suspend the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Angela,
Yes.
Mr. Jaber,
Yes.
Mr. Greer,
Yes.
Mr. Griffin,
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn,
yes,
Mrs. Frye,
Yes.
Mrs. DeBevick,
Yes.
Mr. Heidi.
Yes.
Motion to adopt, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 99-2020.
And Mrs. DeBevick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Fry's motion on adoption.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Fry, and second by Mrs. DeBevick, to adopt ordinance number 99, 2020. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Heidi,
Yes.
Mrs. DeBevick,
Yes.
Mrs. Frye,
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn,
yes,
Mr. Griffin,
Yes.
Mr. Greer,
Yes.
Mr. Jaber,
Yes.
Mrs. Angela.
Yes.
Resolution number 100, 2020, presented by Mrs. Frye, titled COVID-19 Fire Paramedic Personnel. A resolution declaring fire paramedic personnel as being substantially dedicated to mitigating and preventing the spread of COVID-19 and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
And Mrs. DeBevick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Fry's motion on suspension.
Thank you. The motion was made by Mrs. Fry, second by Mrs. DeBevick, to suspend the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Griffin,
Yes.
Mrs. Angela,
Yes.
Mr. Heidi,
Yes.
Mr. Jaber,
Yes.
Mrs. Frye,
Yes.
Mr. Greer,
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn,
Yes,
Mrs. DeBevick.
Yes.
Motion to adopt, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of resolution number 100-2020.
Thank you, and Mrs. DeBevick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mrs. Fry's motion on adoption.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Fry and second by Mrs. DeBevick to adopt resolution number 100-2020. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. DeBevick,
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn,
yes,
Mr. Greer,
Yes.
Mrs. Frye,
Yes.
Mr. Jaber,
Yes.
Mr. Heidi,
Yes.
Mrs. Angela,
Yes.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Ordinance number 101-2020, presented by Mrs. Frye, title appropriation, local coronavirus relief fund. An ordinance appropriating $998,205.16 from the unappropriated item of the local coronavirus relief fund to the personnel service budget of the local coronavirus relief fund and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rules required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you, and Mrs. DeBevick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Fry's motion on suspension.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Fry and second by Mrs. DeBevick to suspend the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Coburn,
yes,
Mr. Griffin,
Yes.
Mr. Jaber,
Yes.
Mrs. Angela,
Yes.
Mrs. DeBevick,
Yes.
Mr. Greer,
Yes.
Mr. Heidi,
Yes.
Mrs. Frye.
Yes.
Motion to adopt, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 101-2020.
Thank you, and Mrs. DeBevick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Fry's motion on adoption.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Fry and second by Mrs. DeBevick to adopt ordinance number 101-2020. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Frye,
Yes.
Mr. Heidi,
Yes.
Mr. Greer,
Yes.
Mrs. DeBevick,
Yes.
Mrs. Angela,
Yes.
Mr. Jaber,
Yes.
Mr. Griffin,
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn.
yes,
Resolution number 102-2020, presented by Mrs. Frye, titled Ohio Deferred Compensation. A resolution to adopt an additional plan offered by Ohio Deferred Compensation and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rules required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you, and Mrs. DeBevick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Fry's motion on suspension.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Fry, second by Mrs. DeBevick to suspend the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Greer,
Yes.
Mrs. Frye,
Yes.
Mrs. Angela,
Yes.
Mr. Heidi,
Yes.
Mr. Jaber,
Yes.
Mrs. DeBevick,
Yes.
Mr. Griffin,
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn.
yes,
Motion to adopt, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of resolution number 102-2020.
And Mrs. DeBevick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Fry's motion on adoption.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Fry and second by Mrs. DeBevick to adopt resolution number 102-2020. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Coburn,
yes,
Mr. Griffin,
Yes.
Mrs. DeBevick,
Yes.
Mr. Jaber,
Yes.
Mr. Heidi,
Yes.
Mrs. Angela,
Yes.
Mrs. Frye,
Yes.
Mr. Greer.
Yes.
Ordinance number 103-2020, presented by Mrs. Frye, titled Temporary Modification of the Non-Bargaining Personnel Policy. An ordinance to temporarily modify the non-bargaining
Attention all Lakeview
personnel policy.
YMCA members, the time is now 7:33 and the pool in the gym will be closing in
To
10
allow,
minutes.
to allow a one-time allowance for eligible employees to carry over an additional 5 days of vacation leave earned in 2020 into 2021.
Motion to suspend, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rules required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you, and Mrs. DeBeck.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Fry's motion on suspension.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Fry, second by Mrs. DeBevick, to suspend the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. DeBevick?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes,
Mr. Henry?
Yes.
Mr. Greer?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Motion to adopt, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 103-2020.
Thank you, and Mrs. DeBevick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Fry's motion on adoption.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Fry, second by Mrs. DeBevick, to adopt ordinance number 103-2020. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Greer?
Yes.
Mr. Henry?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
yes,
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. DeBevick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Ordinance number 104-2020, presented by Mrs. Fry, titled Authorized Payment, United States Department of the Interior. An ordinance authorizing the Director of Finance to pay an invoice to the United States Department of the Interior, United States Geological Survey, in the amount of $60,000 for expenses incurred for the installation of 2 stream gauges with precipitation gauges at each location and declaring emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rules required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you, and Mrs. DeBevick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Fry's motion on suspension.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Fry, second by Mrs. DeBevick, to suspend the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mr. Greer?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
yes,
Mrs. DeBevick?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Henry?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Motion to adopt, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 104-2020.
Thank you. And Mrs. DeBevick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mrs. Fry's motion on adoption.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Fry, second by Mrs. DeBevick, to adopt ordinance number 104-2020. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Henry?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. DeBevick?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
yes,
Mr. Greer?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Motion to adopt, Mrs. Fry.
We just did that.
Yeah, we just adopted it.
Okay.
I was like, I don't have any more check marks. Resolution number 105-2020, presented by Mrs. Fry, titled Amend Resolution number 89-2020, Additional Tax Levy Resolution to proceed to the ballot. A resolution to proceed with the submission of the ballot question of levying an additional 3 mil tax to ensure sufficient funds for current operating expenses of the city of Barberton and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
And Mrs. DeBevick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I second Mrs. Fry's motion on suspension.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Fry, second by Mrs. DeBevick, to suspend the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Hyde?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
yes,
Mrs. DeBevick?
No.
Mr. Greer?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
No.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Motion to adopt, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of resolution number 105-2020.
Thank you. And Mrs. DeBevick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Fry's motion on adoption.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Fry, second by Mrs. DeBevick to adopt resolution number 105-2020. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Angela,
Yes.
Mrs. Fry,
Yes.
Mr. Zerber,
No.
Mr. Griffin,
Yes.
Mr. Krueger,
Yes.
Mrs. DeBevick,
No.
Mrs. Coburn,
Yes,
Mr. Heidi,
Yes.
6-2. And the first reading.
Second reading of ordinances and resolutions.
There are none.
Third reading of ordinances and resolutions.
There are none.
Appointments,
I have none.
miscellaneous and unfinished business. Okay, anything from the body? Department heads. Mrs. Angela.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just wanted to make the announcement that Wednesday, the planning commission meeting that is scheduled for Wednesday, September 16th, will be held here at the Astor Develop Center.
Okay, thank you. Anything else?
Will that be open to the public also, or same rules?
Same rules.
Anybody else? Okay, communications from the mayor.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I want to thank all elected officials and others who attended the fire department's 9/11 ceremony this past Friday. We'll never forget the day our country was attacked. And we'll always honor those victims and heroes who helped that day. So thank you for those who everyone came out to that. I appreciate the passage of ordinance 91/2020, formation of the CIC. This is a key and important tool in our toolbox for development in town. This is not the be-all end-all for development, but it's a step in the right direction, especially when it's coupled with the other tools that are at our disposal. For example, if you've been reading the paper, DCDC received an EPA grant of over $1 million to help with small business. That's a funding mechanism that's not eligible to be granted to cities, but it's granted to things like CIC. So just imagine if we had $2 million in town to give to small businesses. So it's definitely a step in the right direction. Tonight, there are several other pieces of legislation that are vital to the infrastructure of the community that passed, and more will be coming. So if it's water systems, road infrastructure, or resurfacing, or parks, it's vital to the Marvin community that we continue to get its fair share of grant money. Because other communities are doing it, it's out there, and so it's very important that we continue to apply for these grant funds. Also, ordinance 99/2020, raising the income level for Marvin Residential Services Relief Program. People are hurting, we know this. And this piece of legislation will increase the number of residents in the community that we can help. So thank you for passing that piece of legislation. Internally, we continue to work through the COVID pandemic, including funding for the city, funding for small businesses, and other funding to help during these times. Based on COVID case numbers, Summit County last week was elevated to level red. And we continue to monitor these numbers. We have a weekly call that I put on with department heads and review these cases and updates. I know that we're all still getting used to the new norm, which the new norm continues to change and but normal. But we must all remember that changes are daily with COVID. There's no playbook in dealing with this pandemic, whether it's government, it's schools, businesses, or residents. We're all just trying to work through this and doing everything that we can. So it's important to remember when normal events, like city-sponsored events, school functions, or other typical types of items or events are canceled or modified, please remember we're all trying to get through this. There is no playbook. Everyone's doing the best they can. I have confidence in all of our leaders across the board that they're making the best decisions possible. So when I talk to residents or business owners, some of the changes, cancellations, modifications, they affect people and businesses in different ways. So we make sure that everyone understands the rules. It's not the City of Marvin's rule necessarily. It's from higher above, and we have to go by those rules and do everything we can to make sure that everyone is staying as safe as possible. Continue to work on the 2021 budget and projects and programs, which we know will change over the course of the rest of the year. So we're looking for the quarter and navigate through the finances. It's going to be very difficult to move forward. You know, we have a levy on the ballot, as do a lot of other communities and organizations. It's not easy to ask for more money, but we've done everything, and more information on provide more information on what we've done in the past, why there's a need, and where we're going in the future. But we're not alone in this. So, then I'll just lastly mention again that my door is always open. It's imperative that if council has questions on any piece of legislation or anything else, that you call me, we set up a meeting and we can talk about it. So I don't bring everything here to council. So if there's a question that comes up, which questions do come up, I wanted to make sure that everyone has the right answers. So my door's always open. It's imperative that you need to, if there are questions. So with that, I pass. Thank you.
Thank you. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Thank you,
Mr. Beck.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to make a motion to adjourn.
And Mr. Hyde.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion to adjourn.
Thank you. It was moved by Mrs. DeVetta and seconded by Mr. Hyde that we adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We are adjourned at 7:50.
Question of today.
Welcome back. Welcome back.
Hey, thanks. I'm happy to be here.
You have a real.
I don't know if it's because I'm too close to all this. So I was moving around, I got people